We are filming a interview for the Hamilton Jazz Archives with our guest today, Claude Williams, virtuoso violinist. Pleased to meet you.
Same here, sir.
hmm Tell me, you've been playing for a long time, a lot of great music, a lot of great performance. What
Yes.
first attracted you to the guitar and the violin?
Well, my brother-in-law knew quite a bit about strings, and he started me out on. He used to sit around the house and play the old blues on the guitar, and I'd watch him when he lay the guitar down. I'd pick it up and play the blues, and he saw that I was interested, and he went and bought a mandolin, and he would pick the melody on the mandolin and show me the changes on the guitar. So I actually played guitar first. I got where it was pretty good, but when he'd lay the mandolin down, I'd pick it up and play that and going from the mandolin and he needed a bass in his string band, not knowing that a cello was too light, was also a lead instrument. But we got the cello and took the strings off, put bass strings on cello, and I played bass for him until Joe Venuti came through my school here. I heard him. He had played at the outdoors pavilion. I was about half a block from him, close as I could get. And I told Mama that's what I wanted to play. So the next day they changed the cello and brought me a violin home. And no problem. I played the violin because it's the same as the mandolin, EADG, only mandolin got double strings. And you pick that, and so I just picked up the fiddle and started playing it. And they often asked me some of them to play the first tune I remember playing on the violin. And the name of that tune was "You Got to See Your Mama Every Night, or You Can't See Your Mama at All."
I want to ask you, now, in some of those early days, the bands had string players, is that right?
Well, not too early. I mean, violin was an important important instrument for symphonies or big bands that got in a violin session or something like that. But as far as just one violin, you hardly ever seen that in an orchestra.
Uh-huh. Now, tell us how you got started playing the guitar for Basie.
Well, like I said, guitar was my first instrument. I knew I'd played that before I did the violin. And it was quite a hit, the guitar was, for the type of violin that I played, man. I knew about changes, minors and diminishes and augments and things like that. I mean, where a whole lot of violin players didn't know nothing about that.
And how did your guitar playing help you when you decided to play jazz on the violin?
Well, on account of me knowing about the changes, chords and things, And, well, I took my first lesson. I could play better than the teacher, but I didn't know what I was playing, so I still had to start over from, C, D, E, F, G, A, D, down, bowing all day and all of that. But I don't know, it took me a long time to be able to play in tune, but by it being my brother-in-law's string band, he was just carrying me around, until got where I could play pretty close. I remember when my brother went into service in the war, I believe it was 1918, I was playing "How You Gonna Keep On Down on the Farm."
Let me ask you, you talk about the technique of playing the violin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unlike a guitar, a violin doesn't have any frets.
No.
And
That's the reason it took me so long to be able, me or anybody, so long to be able to play in tune, Don't have no frets. But like you said, why or how did the guitar help helped me play violin. Like I said, by me knowing that CEG was a C chord, and CEG and B flat was a 7,
Uh-huh.
and a 6, and augmented whatever, you know.
So that helped you to construct melodic lines
Yes.
along the confines of harmony. You actually understood the harmony rather than just playing individual notes.
Well, along with all, you play the melody, and all the melodies, well, now they have the changes up over the melody. But way back, you had to figure out the changes and chords yourself. I mean, they didn't do all that. And like a pianist could be a finished piano player, could play anything she see. When you ask her to make you see diminished chords, she didn't know what you're talking about, because they didn't teach that.
That's another thing I wanted to ask you is, so you basically learned by ear. You didn't study jazz in schools back then.
No, they didn't teach that like.
So
What are you talking about?
how did you learn?
Well, from
Records?
from other string band musicians coming through there, and they playing different tunes, and as far as jazz, I mean, jazz is just a way you attack some notes, from like eighth note to the 16th note or something, and you go from just playing a tune with knowing the chords and things. That help you to add something to the tune. And the easiest thing, like a blues, blues is a 12 measure thing, and actually you can take 4 chords and play the whole 12 measures, and then you can add 15 or 20 more chords to it, passing chords.
Uh-huh. Yeah. On one of your albums, you have a tune called The Fiddler, where you mix jazz inflections with country influences. Tell us about that.
Well, now the fiddle is just actually a type of blues, and with different changes and things you add to it, Every 3 or 4 notes, or every measure, you play a different change, but it still starts from a blues ideas. Like I tell people, Charlie Parker came up, in Kansas City, and I tell people that I taught Charlie Parker how to play, and they look at me like I'm crazy or something, But Charlie, every time you see him, he'd have his horn in a sack, in his instruction book, and he could play anything in the instruction book, he could read anything, but he didn't have nobody showed him how to go from major to a minor, from a 7 to a diminished. And once he got that down, couldn't stop him.
So you helped him with his chord vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us some of the other musicians that you played with.
Oh, man. I really can't think of all the names, but I've dipped in with so many different. I was originally it turned out to be Andy Kirk's 12 Clouds of Joy. It was first a fellow by the name of T. Holder, and T. Holder was from Muskogee, also at my home. He gave me first job. He had a band in Tulsa at by the name of the Louvre, where you know anything about a jitney dance? You ever heard of jitney dance?
No, tell me. I think this is something new for me.
Well, this was the Louvre there in Tulsa, and jitney dance is a 10 cents dance thing. Like a man would go by and buy a row of tickets and then go by and ask a lady to dance. And if she wanted to dance, and there was a fella standing at the gate there, he'd go by and hand him his tickets, and when he get enough in this ring here, he'd call out, said, "Now we'll have a foxtrot." So we had to be ready to play that foxtrot right then. And we played by maybe 2 courses, and he'd blow the whistle at the end of that dime, you know, and he'd go by and ring you off, and by the time you get them all out, there would be another bunch going in, and every time, you know, you'd go into the ring, you'd ask some lady to give a ticket, and well, they was making so much money then they gave away a brand new Ford every Friday night if you have the right ticket, you know. You tie your ticket off and you keep the stub, you know, and you put your stub, part of the stub tickets in the thing where they dropped it. And they go in there and at the end of the week and feel around $8.92 or something like that. That's you. You got a brand new Ford.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this is, you know, back then you talked about playing music for dances. How is the jazz different today? Do people still dance to it, or has that changed the music?
Well, you really haven't changed the music, but just different styles of dancing with, you know, music be different tempos, and so that'll change your dancing. You know, like when back in jitterbug days, but we still playing the same music, but probably playing a little faster for the jitterbugs, you know. And then what made such a big difference in music over here, you know, they didn't teach music in school for about 10 years in some schools, you know. Long about that time, that's when the Beatles came over with rock and roll, and they wasn't playing that much boom, boom, boom. So that's what they would listen to the dance. They really wasn't listening to no music, pretty music enough to dance, because they just listened to that beat. And that took over for at least 10 years, man. But now they're teaching music in school. A kid know what to listen for when they hear a diminished chord or minor chord or something. They appreciate that because they know what it is.
Tell us, what is one of the most fun experiences you've had as a musician, or one of the most awkward experiences?
Well, I've had a lot of fun because I played with a lot of different musicians, and you know, all of them. If you take like 3 or 4 musicians, all of them play the same tune down. They all have different ideas, you know, and then one would be, if it's pretty to me, it might not be pretty to you, but they play something else that's sound pretty to you. And I always enjoyed a saxophone, and you know, I used to like the way Ben Webster would play, you know, and some stuff Coleman Hawkins would play. So I came to New York. I was up in New York in I believe 76. At a club they call Michael Club, and he said my violin sounded like an instrument, you know. So didn't sound like you hear a violin in a symphony, because I was playing changes and chords, you know, like same as sax. I like a trumpet. I heard when Louis Armstrong made an introduction to, let's see, can't think of the song right now, but he played a diminished chord for his introduction. Da 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 do dee, da 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 do dee da da, diminished. So I like those kind of changes, you know.
Is there any one style of music that you favor above others?
Well, different. Definitely jazz. I mean, I was around all the hillbilly and I don't call it hillbilly. What you call it?
Country?
Yeah, country like they play Nashville. I mean, I was around there because you know, you remember in Tulsa when Playboy Flower. There was that band that played. Was
Wills, Bob Wills?
yeah, Bob Wills. Yeah, you know he broadcast for the Playboy Flower for a long time, man. And he played well, I still call it hillbilly, but it's different. It's a different style of music. But I never, well, along that same time I was playing with my brother-in-law, we'd, you know, take a song and we'd play the melody out, and then after playing the melody, I mean, I'd play some chords or changes or something like that, and that was all completely different from what Bob Wills was playing.
And about the violin, you know, you said in the early days there weren't that many people who played jazz on the violin. Tell us a little bit about this tour that you did with I think it was 4 other violinists that played what they call folk violin.
hmm Oh yeah, well, this tour they had something like 1, 2, 3, 4, either 4 or 5 violins, and we all played a different style. You know, they had kept playing Irish music, Irish violin player, and then we had this girl. Oh, she won all the fiddle contests out east. Can't think of her name right now. She was just about 16 or 17, but she could play that. She was supposed to be a long hair Texas style play, and oh, it's too bad I can't think of her name. Just saw her in New York a few days ago. She's a big star on playing that kind of stuff now. But like I said, 4 or 5 of us, and each one of us played a different style. And mine was jazz. You know, we had so many other I can't think of the different styles they had.
Coming up, being born in Oklahoma, which was the Southwest at that time, can you describe for us how the Southwest sound, like the Count Basie sound, was different from the sounds on the East Coast or the West Coast?
Oh yeah, well, it was different, but I mean, I don't know how I can explain to you the difference because like the Kansas City style was different from any of the styles. The boys would be coming up from the South or Texas and Louisiana and all through there, but they come through Kansas City and change the style somewhere because anytime you tell somebody you're from Kansas City, they know that you're a good musician. That's all. You get Kansas City stamp, you got it made. I can't tell you, it's a different, but I can't put my finger on it. I know at one time Benny Moulton left Kansas City, came up to New York, and he made it real big with what they call the 2/4 beat. Instead of playing like a number like da dum da, he played da do da. That's a 2/4 beat. You know?
Uh-huh.
And they fell in love with Benny Moulton's band.
Yeah. One other thing I would like to ask, and that is, you know, the violin for most people is considered a classical instrument.
Mm-hmm.
What things do you do with your fingers, with your phrasing, with your articulations to convert that instrument to a jazz sound?
Yeah, the chords, as I told you, knowing the changes to play, like you play da do do da do 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 a melody, and then so it's a chord to go on. Da do da do 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 do. You know, that kind of stuff. That's what would add it to jazz, other than just a straight melody.
Uh-huh.
Like I said, the first song I learned on the violin, you got to see your mama every night. You got to see your mama every night. Oh, you can't see your mama at all. You know. So I play. See, that's adding the jazz to it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Embellishing it. Tell us about the usage of blue notes. You heard about that.
Well,
Because you're playing on an instrument where you have to use different fingering techniques.
Yeah, blue. I see you can bend on the violin. You can bend them notes and slur those notes. That's what adds the blues to the. And you slide up, bend it, and makes a different sound.
Now, if we, of course, for our archive here, we're hoping that a lot of young people will see some of these marvelous interviews and glean something. If you had a word that you could leave our young people with, if a young person was coming up wanting to study jazz violin, give them a word of your wisdom.
Well, in a few days, I'll be down in Outright, about 40 miles from Nashville. There's a place down there where, something like 150 or 200 young violins go twice a year and to study violin, and it's by ear. I mean, not notes, you know. So this will be my first year down there to teach them. And we'd heard another teacher down there. He'd start off, have a bunch of kids out there, and he'd start off da 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 da, and have the kids to hum that, hum that, and they say da 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 da. After they hum it a couple of times, he said, now let's play that. Da 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 da. They get where they can play whatever they hum, and that's what they call by ear. You be playing by ear. You don't see no notes or no kind of music, but just, and they play, he would probably start off humming the blues. And have them to hum that much, you know. And when they say, get where they can play it, and they put that together for a 12 measure, and they play in the blues, you know. And that's by ear, strictly by ear.
Tell us about working with Buddy Tate.
Oh, well, I knew Buddy from Texas. Well, he was at home in... I run into him because I was down that way with a band, territory band down there by the name of Alfonso Trent. He was the first black band that played in Adolphus Hotel in Dallas, you know. And, he was pretty well known all over Texas. Alfonso. So Buddy had worked with Alfonso around there in Texas. Something happened. The band finally broke up. And then T. Holder went down there with another different group. And he had picked up Buddy. We played together down in Texas. And I just saw him a few months ago. He's in New York. But he had a couple accidents and he's been kind of sick. He hasn't been doing too much playing, but I went over and made him get his saxophone out and, you know, play, blow a little. So when this jazz, the thing that we, jazz statesman of jazz is supposed to be all retired, not retired, but all musicians from, supposed to be from 65 up, you know. what they call elder statesman. So I had Buddy to come over. I went over, got him, brought him over to New York, and he was there. His pictures is on one of the things we made, blowed a few tunes, and I made him play some on one tune on the tape. But he's still weak, you know. He's on a sick list. We had Buddy one night, must have been about 5 or 6 years ago. I was with Jay McShann. We played a blues festival in Chicago. We had Buddy. He'd been sick then, but we brought him out on the stage and set him down and let him play. Man, he was. It's funny, but just the different tones of the tenor players to have. I mean, Buddy had a different tone, something like well, I don't remember. Herschel Evans got as close to Coleman Hawkins' tone as I've ever heard. But Herschel and Lester, even Coleman would come to Kansas City and have one of them jam sessions. Lester would get on one side and Herschel would get on the other. And Herschel was trying to catch Coleman's tone, big tone he had, but Lester said, just let him play, you don't need no tone. Boy, one time Lester could play more saxophone than anybody ever heard. And it was such a shame. Before he died, I could almost play much saxophone he was, because he was just stuff that he fill up behind. I like the blues singers, you know. Slow stuff. He wasn't playing nothing. But he still had a style, and then different saxophone would try to play his style that he had when he passed.
Had an individual voice.
Hmm?
He had an individual voice on the instrument.
Yeah, just Lester had, just like Coleman had different thing. He couldn't get that big tone Coleman had.
Do you think there are violinists that try to copy your style?
Well, it could, but it's a few violin players that, it's a lot of good violin players that I consider better than me now, but it's a different style. Like Grappelli plays a beautiful fiddle, but I was over in London, last year before last, I was following, like Grappelli would play here this week, and he'd move on, I'd play back. So they would say, yeah, well, Grappelli plays pretty, but I'd rather hear you, you know. My style was still different.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Kansas City scene. Can you tell us how it changed from the 30s going into the 40s and the 40s to the 50s?
Well, only change it made is different attacks, but they on notes, and when it hit an eighth note, and then whole note, and then a couple eighth notes, da-da, you know, and then da-da, just different ways they was writing music. And everything changing. Like years back, Duke Ellington was so far advanced in his music, like the music he would write and play for one while they were singing. Duke Ellington was playing discord, but they didn't know what they was listening to. They finally woke up where Duke was playing some flat fifths and some raised ninths and things like that. You know. Wasn't no discord, but once they found out what was happening, they tried to write it.
Yeah. Tell us about your Labor Day concert that you did in 1994.
Well, Labor Day, I might have played something and didn't know where in a particular place.
Kansas City, the Nelson Art Museum.
Oh yeah, well I played there, but then other than wasn't a Labor Day thing. I mean, I played there something like at least 2 or 3 times a year, and I'm supposed to play there. This one year I didn't play there because I was in New York pretty often. See, my fellow that books me live in New York, and he got an apartment. Anytime I want to stay, lay around New York, I mean, I can lay around and won't cost me nothing. You know, a room and stuff like that, because it's his place. But other than that, I couldn't be around New York without working, because hotel rooms run, around $100 or better. And you got to be working, have something going to lay around New York.
I want to just ask you a kind of final question here. Is, you've seen a lot of music and played with a lot of great players.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see for the future of jazz? Where do you see it going? Or at least the future of jazz violin playing?
Well, let me see. It's like new things is happening every day. It's gonna be some type of a change, but I mean, I couldn't say right now what, because like I know anywhere from 6 to 8 good violin players, and they all play a different style. And even if it's gonna read a sheet now, if they all read the same sheet, there would be a difference, because different one would have different ways to attack the note, because there's a correct way to attack, that they teach, and others just another way of attacking, because you can take lessons on a fiddle for 20 years, before you're able to set in a symphony.
Mm-hmm.
They called me to join this Black and Blue review show in New York, and they first called a boy in Philadelphia, John Blake, they called me. But John didn't want to leave his family, so I said, why don't you get Claude Williams? Well, they had never heard of me, so John said, yeah, say I got one of his albums. So he played a little taste of the album. I said, yeah, I use him. So he called me, and I know it was sort of frightening, to play a show. I know you're going to have to be able to read pretty good, I figured. I told him, I said, well, man, I can read music, but I ain't no symphony man. Like where I have to sight read or something. You put it down, let me play it down a time or two, and I play it. So he was listening to my album. He said, oh yeah, you can make it clear. So didn't have no trouble. He had easy charge.
Oh. And so that kind of gave you that pit experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's on the same key.
Yeah. Well, I want to, yeah.
You just ask Claude about
You just go ahead.
just some stories. I'd like you to ask them so we have it on tape.
Okay.
Some of the early stories about traveling down to Florida and how that worked with the money they were making, and then being picked up, how the Count came to find you. Just a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we jumping a long way. Like different times they'd have down in Florida, it was down south and it was quite segregated then, And we played some dances for whites that the colored couldn't go to, and then vice versa, we played something for colored that they wouldn't let the whites go to. Down south, it was all messed up like that. Like I said, I heard Joe Benuti. I was standing about almost a block, at least half a block from the pavilion, about as close as I could get to it. And he was in my hometown, in Muskogee then. And let's see, that's down there. And I knew Count before, Count in Kansas City, way before he had a chance to get in a group together. We jam up and down the street there. And when Count had been playing with Benny Moten, and Benny Moten had he got killed. He and doctor was out partying all night and went and had to have his tonsils taken out, and never did wake up on it until we killed him. And well, that doctor left Kansas City. I don't know whatever happened to him, but then so Benny Moe band broke up down to Count was playing with Benny then to just Count just picked a few people that he wanted, and started a small group there, and joined there, and they called it Reno in Kansas City. And he picked, like him, drummer, and bass. There's a big Walter Page, he called Big, and he was a Blue Devils. The Blue Devils band had just broke up too about a year before then. So Count picked out a rhythm section and some one or two saxophones or something like that, and was playing there at this Reno club there in Kansas City where they broadcast every night. It was such a strong station. I never will forget the W9XBY. It was a station you could hear just as good in New York as you could in Kansas City. So what happened? They broadcast every night from 12 to 12:30, or by 12:30 to 1, something like that. And I hear Benny Goodman picked up the thing one night, and Benny told his brother-in-law, which was John Hammonds, about the group. And John Hammonds checked in. He went down to Kansas City and listened to it. Meantime, he was delighted with what he heard, and he laid some cash on Count for him to sort of get him enlarge his band. And I had been around Chicago playing. I'd played with Nat Cole and his brother. His brother had a band there, and King was the best piano player in Chicago then, but he didn't know he could sing. He didn't even try to sing, and he just played good piano. So a little thing happened. I didn't stay with them very long. So I was back in Chicago, and Count heard that I was up there. He came up and picked me up, went back to Kansas City and he to enlarge his band. We enlarged it up to, I think, 12 or 13 pieces. At the time, Herschel was out here in California. Lester was there, Beacon was there, and the trumpet player, what they call Hot Lips, Page, he was there. He had two different bands right there in Kansas City to pick from, because the Blue Devils had broke up, and some of them was there, which Hot Lips and Walter Page was Blue Devils, and Lester came up there with Blue Devils. So he really didn't have to do too much more after he got me finished out the rhythm section. And Buck Clayton just happened to come through because Buck lived in Parson, Kansas, and he'd been living out here in L.A. So that's what happened with me joining Count.
When did you do your first recordings?
Well, I really didn't get to do a record too many. I think just one session would count because I didn't stay with him. After we got to New York, along with John Hammonds, he also told Count about me because some of his boys had been through Peoria, Illinois, and I had been playing at a hotel there, and they checked on me I was playing fiddle and guitar. I played some of both. So I was playing guitar, and after we got to New York, John Hammonds had promised some musicians there, first chance I get, I'm gonna put you with one of my bands, So I got my notice in Kansas City, in New York. I was #1 guitarist in New York in the downbeat, Told a friend of mine, man, I got my notice here. He said, oh man, ain't nobody in New York fill your spot. I said, hell it ain't. And I had my notice in my pocket, you know. So that was Freddie Green. I mean, he stayed with Count 40 more years or something after that. But Freddie couldn't. I was playing good guitar. After I left there, I said, well, I'm gonna just try to play some fiddle, because guitar was a hard instrument, and it was a thing where after I played some guitar with the chords, there's so much different between the chords, and then when you play fiddle, you had to close back up, positions closer. It would take me a course before I could play in tune almost, so I just dropped the guitar. I said, I'm just gonna play fiddle. So that's the reason I'm just mostly playing fiddle.
And you have quite a reputation as playing that fiddle, too.
Yeah, well, it's, like I said, so different. So a lot of good fiddle players, but we are all different.
We would say you have a distinctive voice on the instrument.
Mm-hmm.